Now let's move forward to our first question. What is prehistory and why do we study it? Now, prehistory, just roughly defined for our purposes, is the period in the human past that escapes even the oldest means of written documentation. So, di ba nakita natin kanina na nagsisimula yung period na to at about 250,000 years ago, which is likely when or which is the earliest evidence for human migration to the Philippines, right? So, natao na yung Pilipinas pero wala pa tayong mga ebidensya that would speak of the um, written documentation that would tell us about the kinds of lives they lived. So even in other documents during this period, more or less, um, we do not find traces yet of any mentions of Philippines or pre-Filipinos in texts. So during this time, then, the way we reconstruct prehistory is to look at different artifacts. So, this leads us to the question of how we study prehistory. Yes. So here are the sources or some sources for prehistory. No? If we don't have written documentation, what do we look to in order to understand migratory patterns, the diets of the people of the time, or the way they looked, in order to understand the evolution of Philippine or the evolution of people in the Philippines, or even to understand the ethnicization or the creation of different cultures here. Now we have three general areas of sources for prehistory. The first one, and perhaps the most exciting, is language and genetics. Now, some linguists have reconstructed the way we speak through time by using dictionaries, but also by trying to date, which languages in Southeast Asia, in Australasia, in Polynesia, Micronesia are older than others. And by determining these links between languages, they're able to hypothesize where people came from. Now, another interesting and related source of evidence is genetics. Now, one of the more dominant studies on the paano ba to? If you want to look at the movement of people, right? One of the things that you're gonna look at, along with their movements from island to island, would be the food they brought with them. Now, there's a study by a Philippine scholar called Filomeno Aguilar, and he looked at the domestication of the banana. So may mga kinds of banana kasi na mas I guess they're more I'm not really a biologist, so I'm just gonna say more wild, less domesticated, and there are kinds of bananas that are more domesticated. To my understanding, ito yung mga mas maliliit na yung seeds. So, hinanap nila yung mga varieties of bananas across Southeast Asia at tinignan nila kung ano yung na-establish na pattern of, okay, dahan-dahan lang nadadomesticate yung kinds of bananas na nahahanap natin dito. And so they used that as additional evidence in order to support claims for where the early Southeast Asians, including those who would become Filipinos, came from. So that's very exciting stuff. May lumabas din, di ba, na recent study about how our Negrito groups, particularly yung mga Aita, have very old DNA. I think it was Denovian DNA. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong. Pero they have some of the oldest DNA in the world. So, natatrace back yung genetic pool nila to early migrations from cradles of civilization. And this is fascinating because here we are, living people who would just carry our DNA with us, and yet that can serve as additional evidence to help us understand how people got here in the first place and how we started mixing bloodlines and cultures and languages along the way. So that's the first set of sources. The second set of sources are material culture. Now, you're going to notice that there's an overlap between habitation patterns and material culture, but we'll focus on material culture first. Now, you kind of encountered material culture na when we talked about the kinds of primary sources. But here, really, we're talking about jars, yung trash piles, leftover bones and bits and tools, diba? as well as yung mga clothing, ganyan. Items that tell us about the ways of life people had in the past. Now, the interesting thing about material culture is it can be found in context or out of context. Now, when material culture is found in context, often this is found in excavation sites such as those found in, later we'll see the Santa Ana excavation site. But yung mga items na 'to, nakikita natin kung paano sila naggamit in the context of the culture that used them. So that can be derived from, as I said earlier, excavation sites, but also in living cultures. For example, heirloom items that have been passed down for different generations in families. So usually artifacts that are very, very old, we can detect or we can find coming from indigenous peoples groups. Yung mga pinapass down nila as heritage items. So this includes pots, jewelry, and so on and so forth. Now, very few of these items will date back to the period we're studying now, but we can kind of see how itong items na to really are clues to the ways people lived in the past and to the beliefs that they may have carried with them. Now, how is this different from habitation patterns? Habitation patterns often are distinguishable in the physical space. Remember, in Module 2, we discussed spatiality and how it's so important as a context for human development as in the process of studying history. Now, habitation patterns tell us how people organize their everyday lives within certain spaces. Nakikita natin to sa burial sites, for example, but also yung mga natabunan na old actual habitation sites, so old communities. Now, there is a very interesting thought that still circulates now in the Philippine social scientific community that, Manila, di ba? So imagine Manila, the heart of Manila is Intramuros, or the historical heart of Manila is Intramuros, which is the old Spanish walled city, right? Now, Intramuros was built in about 1565, well, not 1565, 1570s onwards by the Spanish after they had razed to the ground, they had destroyed the old kingdom of Maynila. That was headed by Sultan, well, he wasn't a sultan, sorry, by Raja Sulaiman, who was one of the more powerful pre-Hispanic Filipinos. Now, the question is, what happened to the old habitation site? Was it all destroyed? Or do foundations of that old community still survive under the streets of Intramuros? Now, every now and then, may lumalabas na parang proposal to unearth some aspects or some parts of Intramuros para mahanap nila yung early evidence of this old community. But of course, that's very complicated, especially considering that Intramuros is one of our oldest heritage sites as it is now. So, yun yung importance of habitation patterns. They're kind of like cross sections into a life lived a long, long time ago. Now, here is an example of an excavation site, one of the most important excavation sites in the Philippines for pre-Hispanic communities. This is found in Santa Ana in the area of Greater Metro Manila. Now, this is a picture from the post-war era, Cold War era na yan, Mrs. Lady Bird Johnson and Dr. Robert Fox in the excavation of the Santa Ana churchyard for pre-Spanish Manila through the archaeology project of the National Museum of the Philippines. So, ganyan yung itsura ng ibang excavation sites. And what sorts of items do we find for this time period? For the most part, kasi ang layo ng span from 250,000 years ago to 500, 300 BC. Makikita natin dito na na-encompass niya yung stone tool age ng humanity, di ba? Hindi na natin i-memorize kung ano yung metal age ng Pilipinas at ano yung stone tool age ng Pilipinas. Ang mas maigi na natin dapat maalala ay yung uri ng ebidensya na mahahanap sa time span na to try to imagine the kinds of life people lived then. Now, here are images of stone tools and pottery shards that have been excavated from multiple sites. So, hindi ito yung exact na in-excavate nila, pero Very similar yung mahahanap natin sa Pilipinas. Now, another very interesting recent discovery, and this was discovered in about 2019 through an excavation headed, I think, also by the National Museum of the Philippines, right? So, you will know that if you look at the Philippine archipelago, we're archipelagic, and therefore people arrived here after at least the melting of the ice caps, no? The arrival of the recent geological time span, which we'll see later, people had arrived here through boat. Now, one of the most exciting recent discoveries is something called the Butuan mother boat. Now, for reference, most of the boats that are of Southeast Asian origin na nahanap na napadpad sa Pilipinas ay mga ganito kalaki. So, ito yung sinasabi nating balangay, no? Barangay, balangay, these ships that are mythologically supposed to be the ships that brought the first barangays to the Philippines, and the reason why we call our barangays barangays. Kasi sila yung mga magkakasama pagkagating nila dito. Di ba yun yung kwento? Now, the standard sized balangay is found here, and you can compare that to the size of an average man here. And the boat that they found in 2019 is almost two and a half sizes larger than your average boat that has been found here. And the exciting implications of this is, kung ganito kalaki yung na-excavate nila, how many people had they brought with them? Was this a warship? Was it a trade ship? How far did it go across the Pacific or maybe even across the Indian Ocean? Kasi when you build a boat this big, you're either traversing a very, very long area or a very, very far area, or you are carrying a lot of items with you. And either way, it speaks of a level of technological ability and organization to be able to build the boat in the first place. No? Now, ang cool din kung saan nila ito nahanap. Kasi, okay, so for reference, Butuan is a city in the northwestern part of Mindanao. And it's right beside, parang may little sea, may port dun eh. Tapos right outside the city port, nagde-dredge kasi sila para ipalalim yung port area, 'di ba? Pag medyo tumataas na yung level of silt, even like in Burnham Lake, they have to remove all of the silt in order for the water to flow easier, lalala. Yung mga ganyang items. Anyway, it was a typical kind of procedure. And then as they were dredging the bottom of the port, they hit some items that looked like they were artifacts. At ito yung nahanap nila. So they didn't actually find the whole boat. What they found is the bottom of it. Tapos tinignan na lang nila kung paano i-restructure to at kung ano likely yung size ng larger boat from that. So, ayun, exciting discoveries that raise new questions about the level of interaction our ancestors had. Okay, speaking of linguistic evidence, here is an excerpt from the Doctrina Christiana, which was published in Manila in 1593. This was at the beginning, just a couple of decades after the beginning of Spanish colonization here. Now, the scribes, usually these were friars or padres, no, who wrote the Doctrina Christiana, were writing this because they were studying how to how to spread the Christian faith. And you can't really spread the Christian faith if you don't speak the language. Interestingly enough, one of the scripts that they included in the Doctrina is Baybayin, because they encountered mostly Tagalog speakers, diba, when they set up shop in the area of Manila. So ito yung isang pinili nilang script to put in that book. Now, here is a transcription from the Doctrina Christiana then of, well, it's a facsimile, meaning it's a fax of a page of the Doctrina Christiana. And it might look a little antiquated to you and me, no? But if we try to read it, see, you try to read it for a bit. Just look at the words, even if the spellings are a little different. Look for things that might be familiar to you. And a couple of words might stand out here. It's spelled a little strangely, of course, kasi yung Spanish yung nagtatranscribe. But it says, kapapakasama ng kaluluwa kay pito. Right? Kapapakasama ng kaluluwa kay pito. Which, once you then read what which once you start reading actually is the seven deadly sins, which is fascinating. So I won't read the rest for you, so you can try to guess what the words are and what old Tagalog words coincide with our understanding of the seven deadly sins now. Now, why is this an exciting piece of evidence? Because this was written over 300 years ago. And you and I'm not a very good Tagalog Filipino speaker, but even I can understand some words. And in the culture we bring with us, the language we speak in our everyday lives, are clues which survive time. Now, I'm not saying that this is evidence for the prehistorical period, no, but it's just a little bit of an exercise to show us how linguists reconstruct which languages are older than others and what ideas survive through them, and so on and so forth. So, pagdating naman sa material evidence, one of the most important ones is called the Manunggol jar, which was found in the Tabon Cave complex in Palawan. Now, this is carbon dated to have been made between 895 to 775 BC, which is within the time period we're studying now. Now, the Manunggol jar, of course, does not come with instruction manuals or any kind of written explanation for what it is. But from the item itself, many scholars from archaeology, history, and cultural studies have looked at it and said that this burial jar tells us about the belief of early Filipinos in an afterlife that is related to the sea. Because at the very top of the jar, you find this boat and two anthropomorphic or person like figures at the top on the boat. So, alam mo yun, why would you go through the trouble of creating these little figurines and creating this little boat, which would have been quite, difficult at the time, if these were not significant to the act of burying someone who probably was quite important to the community that made this jar. So, it's kind of like a guessing game, piecing together these clues to try to understand what their lives were like in this period.